1905. St. Mary's Institute was a small school located in the growing city of Dayton, Ohio. There were just 78 young men enrolled at the 55-year-old school. A few landmarks that later generations would recognize dotted the campus. For those attending, a handful of activities filled their time: bands and orchestras, societies and literary clubs, baseball and basketball teams. New was football. The sport was slow to catch on, very slow. The team was coached by William Shane. He also managed the team and played halfback. Football was far different in the early years of the 20th century. St. Mary's played 3 games against 2 different opponents in 1905. One foe was called the Riverdale Athletic Club, and 2 games were played against a squad from Tip City. They lost all 3. Over the next 15 seasons, there would be up and down years, as well as a number of different nicknames like Regulars, Hilltoppers, and South Parkers. The teams would improve in the ensuing years, and neighboring colleges would soon dot the schedule of St. Mary's Institute. Wilmington, Wittenberg, and Xavier became regular foes. By 1920, alumni of St. Mary's would form the nucleus of the Dayton Triangles, an original member of the American Professional Football Association, which would change its name 2 years later to the National Football League. In 1921, St. Mary's Institute became the University of Dayton, and 2 years later, the school's athletic teams would be known thereafter as the Flyers. 1923 would bring another significant change. Perhaps the most influential person in the early history of UD football would come to Dayton for the first time. The 1920s were a prosperous time in the United States, and sports were booming. College football had become the second most popular sport in the country, and Notre Dame had one of the finest programs in the land. The Dayton Flyers looked to the Fighting Irish to choose the school's first full-time employee in athletics. Harry Baujan was an end on one of the early great Notre Dame teams. His nickname was the Blonde Beast. After graduating in 1917, he served his country during World War I. As the story goes, he received an invitation to interview for the Flyers head coaching job in 1922. Because of flooding, part of the trip from his hometown in Illinois to Dayton was done by rowboat. Baujan got the job, and the University of Dayton was about to make its mark in the world of college football.
Sometimes it's a power of one. You've got a great football coach or a great CEO or whatever, and your organization takes off. And that's what happened with Harry Baujan. Without Harry Baujan, a lot of the University of Dayton would look a lot different than what it is now.
Baujan had success almost immediately. The Flyers won their first game with Baujan as head coach against Indiana Central by a score of 161-0. He had 9 winning seasons in his first decade as head coach, even as the Flyers were continually matched against more established football schools like Cincinnati, Miami, and Boston College. Baujan was a master organizer, but also a tireless promoter of Dayton football. Make no mistake, though, he was a football coach first, with a reputation as a hard-nosed disciplinarian. Dr. Tim Quinn played for the Flyers from 1969 to 72. A generation earlier, his father Joe was on one of Harry Baujan's teams.
And he was a taskmaster. In fact, my dad said that in 1939, UD went out to, or 1940, went out to play St. Mary's College in California, and they took the train out. The train took 5 days to get there. And whenever it would stop, Harry would have the entire team do calisthenics and run drills on the wooden platform at the train station. So he was a very interesting coach.
Harry Baujan oversaw all aspects of the Dayton football program, and it seems that might have included the budget as well. This rare film from 1941 shows the University of Tennessee Volunteers in action at home against Notre Dame. However, a closer look at the records finds that Tennessee is actually playing the University of Dayton. It seems Harry Baujan was saving some money and tapping into some old Fighting Irish connections.
Harry Baujan, being a former Notre Dame football player, had connections with the guys at Notre Dame. Well, Harry got his hands on a bunch of uniforms from Notre Dame. You know, sometimes even though maybe our school colors were trended toward red and blue, you kind of got what you used what you could get.
With Baujan's success came fans of Flyer football, and with that came the need for a true football facility. Until the early 1920s, games were played at several locations around campus. Some were played approximately where today's Kennedy Union stands. A large baseball grandstand loomed over the field. The chapel and Chaminade Hall stood in the distance. It was decided a permanent football stadium was needed. Construction would start down the small hill behind St. Joseph's Hall. When completed in 1925, a steel structure that sat 10,000 would open. A packed house would witness a 17-0 Flyers win over John Carroll in the first game at what was called University of Dayton Stadium. With the success of Harry Baujan and his players, UD football would become the hottest ticket in town in the ensuing decades.
That was the thing to do in Dayton. Dayton football then was what Dayton basketball is now to the community.
Harry Baujan would continue to coach the Flyer football team until 1946, compiling an impressive record of 124, 64, and 8. After leaving the bench in 1946, Baujan stayed on at UD as the school's athletic director. The stadium his drive and determination helped create was renamed Baujan Field in 1961. Baujan would step down as athletic director in 1971, and he passed away in 1976. In 1990, Harry Baujan was posthumously named to the College Football Hall of Fame. After Baujan stepped aside as head coach, Dayton would look again to Notre Dame for their next two head football coaches. The first was Joe Gavin, who took over the Flyers in 1947. He stayed on for 7 seasons, most of them successful. His overall record was 39, 26, and 2. The highlight of the Gavin years was Dayton's very first trip to a bowl game. Following a 1951 7-2 campaign, the Flyers accepted an invitation to the Salad Bowl to be played on New Year's Day 1952 in Phoenix. As one might expect, it was a big deal for the Dayton Flyers to make it to a bona fide bowl game. Many of the memories from the trip are contained in a scrapbook which chronicled the trip. There were tours in and around the Phoenix area in the build-up to the game. Publicity photos were a must, and there was even an appearance on that newfangled medium of television. A crowd of 17,000 witnessed the Flyers take on the Houston Cougars. Dayton took a 21-13 lead into halftime. Unfortunately, the Cougars would reel off 13 unanswered points in the third quarter, and the Flyers would fall 26-21. The 1952 Salad Bowl was the 5th game in the series, and unfortunately, the last. However, the Salad Bowl is generally considered to be the precursor of a bowl game that would begin 2 decades later, a game we now know as the Fiesta Bowl. After Joe Gavin stepped aside in 1953, he'd be succeeded by Notre Dame grad Hugh DeVore, who lasted for 2 seasons, and the Flyers would round out the 1950s with head coach Bud Kerr, who lasted through 1959. The 6 seasons leading up to the end of the 50s were somewhat lackluster for the Flyers. The team had an overall record of just 23, 35, and 2. But to Flyer fans, it didn't matter. The University of Dayton Stadium was the place to be on football Saturdays in the fall, well into the 1960s. The stands were always packed, not only to watch the game, but to take in the surrounding pageantry. The highlight of each fall was homecoming. There was a parade through downtown, of course the crowning of a queen and king, and the game. It's remembered fondly as a wonderful atmosphere by fans and players alike.
I can't remember a home game that wasn't packed. I mean, it was always had a great following.
Pretty amazing, really, to walk out on that field and know that there was 12,000 people there. And the thing that always struck me the funniest was I would look up at St. Joe's Hall, which was right behind the back end of the Baujan there, and there's people hanging out of every window trying to watch the game, you know. So people that wanted to get in the stadium and couldn't, and they go up to St. Joe's and open the windows and watch the games from up there. So that was pretty cool, I thought.
At the time, the Dayton football program was an independent and not affiliated with any particular conference. The Flyers played at the highest level of NCAA football during the era and would have 40 or more scholarship players on the team. Well into the 1960s, the Flyers' schedule would regularly feature schools from the Mid-America Conference. Cincinnati and Louisville were played almost annually, and there were the occasional games against Tennessee and Kentucky. This was also a period of time when freshmen were ineligible to play in games, but they certainly were around for practices and scrimmages. It gave them a chance to become accustomed to playing football at the collegiate level and to adjust to college life.
Well, freshman football was the greatest thing ever. Well, the neat thing was we were a team, so it was just a fun time.
Miami University in Oxford is known as the cradle of coaches. Legends with names such as Brown, Hayes, Parsegan, and Schembechler began careers in Miami. But the University of Dayton certainly doesn't take a backseat to any other program in the country when it comes to producing coaches and executives of the highest caliber. It began in the early 1950s with a player teammates called the Pope because of his vast knowledge of the game. Chuck Noll would lead the Pittsburgh Steelers to 4 Super Bowl titles. Noll would have several Dayton coaches on his Steelers staff as well. Tom Moore and George Perlis would have long careers in the coaching ranks. From 1965 to 72, John McVay was head coach of the Flyers. After a stint as head coach in the short-lived World Football League, he moved on to the San Francisco 49ers as vice president and director of football operations. He oversaw 5 Super Bowl titles while in San Francisco. His grandson, Sean, is the current head coach of the Super Bowl-winning Los Angeles Rams. There's also the story of a backup quarterback for the Flyers. He didn't play much, but knew every single in and out of the game. John Gruden would lead the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to a Super Bowl victory in 2002. At the time, the youngest head coach to ever win the title.
He was the best I ever had on the chalkboard. Understood the game, but competitive. The same thing. He'd get under the center, and he'd get so tense and so nervous, and he'd throw the ball, and he'd be erratic and everything else. But very, very smart, intelligent guy.
Skip ahead a few generations, and there was the day a guy named Lombardi showed up in the Flyer football offices.
So being a sarcastic guy, straightforward kind of guy, I said, "Hey, you got any ties to coaching? Any in your background?" "Yes, sir, I do." "Oh, like what?" "My grandfather coaches professional football." "Vince?" "Yes, sir, he's my grandfather." I wanted to crawl under my desk. I was so embarrassed.
Vince Lombardi's grandson Joe started his coaching career as a volunteer at Dayton. He's moved on to become the offensive coordinator for both the Los Angeles Chargers and the Denver Broncos. And finally, there's Brandon Staley, who lined up at quarterback for the Flyers. He became the head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers. Regardless of the era, it's an impressive list.
But our Super Bowl ring pedigree is, we've had 42 Super Bowl rings, one coming out of the Dayton football coaching or playing staff.
The late 1960s and 70s brought change to college football. Bigger universities had the financial means to inject more resources into the game. It led to inequities with facilities and eventually the level of play. Some schools found it increasingly difficult to offer scholarships, and a few longtime Flyer foes like Xavier and Detroit made the painful decision to drop football. People at Dayton were paying attention to what was happening.
We learned from their mistakes, frankly. We found out from them as colleagues that they regretted doing that. We recognized that football was important, and we recognized that we've got to figure out a way to keep football.
In 1973, the NCAA split into 3 distinct divisions. The Flyers opted to play in the highest classification of Division I. Dayton was still an independent with plenty of games against Mid-American teams. But the financial strain of competing at Division I finally led university officials to decide to move to Division III starting in 1977. Dayton would no longer offer scholarships in football. There were several seasons of confusion as the Flyers had a mix of scholarship and non-scholarship players. But on August 1st, 1979, all players were required to be non-scholarship. Some were forced to make a decision to stay at UD without a scholarship or move on. Most decided to stay.
It was just the onset of that era when people were dropping football or people were de-emphasizing football, and UD was one of the first schools to do that, so it was kind of a testing grounds.
The 1970s brought another significant change in Dayton Flyers football. Baujan Field, the team's home since 1925, had begun to show its age. There was a need to move on. In 1974, the Flyers moved just across the river to Welcome Stadium, next to the University of Dayton Arena. Welcome has a capacity of 11,000 and opened in 1949 as home to all of the city's high school teams. It even hosted a college bowl game, the 1961 Aviation Bowl, played between New Mexico and Western Michigan. For those of you keeping score, New Mexico won 28-12. The upgrade to Welcome Stadium with its artificial turf seemed to suit the Flyers. By 1977, it had become a difficult place for visiting teams to win. 1977 would also mark the start of one of the most memorable eras of Dayton Flyers football. In 1977, Rick Carter came to Dayton from Hanover College in Indiana to become the new head coach of the Flyers. He brought along assistant Mike Kelly to be his defensive coordinator. From the start, players could sense that this was a different kind of head coach, a coach determined to create a successful program on all levels.
You know, he was a master motivator.
Coach Carter, although was small in stature, he was a big personality. Everyone knew the moment he walked in the room that he was in charge, and there was never any question about that.
What Coach Carter and Coach Kelly brought to the University of Dayton was that whole concept of team, which really became family.
With the switch to Division III, an occasional mix of scholarship and non-scholarship players, the late 70s were a time when things could have gone sideways with the Flyers. It never happened. In 1977, the Flyers went 8-3. The next year, Dayton was 9-2-1 and made their very first postseason playoff appearance. In 79, it was more of the same, an 8-2-1 record. Rick Carter and Mike Kelly had become masters at selling recruits on what was happening at UD.
To have that recruiting skill, to get talent that we had with no hopes of getting anything paid for other than maybe a grant, right? It's phenomenal. The players that they found.
The pinnacle of the Rick Carter years as Dayton's head coach would come in 1980. The Flyers blew through their regular season schedule untainted, outscoring their opponents 384-46.
We were talented. We were very talented, and you could see it coming through the years.
No, that team was loaded from all angles, and that team was good.
Coach Carter and the staff did an outstanding job in attracting really good football players for Dayton.
The Flyers thrashed their first playoff opponent, Baldwin Wallace, by a score of 34-0. The national semifinal was a different story. Playing on the road against Widener, Dayton went to the locker room down 24-0 at halftime. After a season that had been so magical, it might have been time to panic. But there were different ideas.
There wasn't any yelling or screaming from the coaches, just had a plan and what we needed to do.
It seemed simple enough. Keep Widener from scoring and pile up points yourself. The plan worked beautifully. With one final touchdown, the Dayton Flyers walked off with a 28-24 victory. UD would play for the national championship. The Stag Bowl, the Division III national championship game, would take place in Phoenix City, Alabama. Ithaca, the defending national champions, would be the opponent. For the players, coaches, everybody involved, it was an incredible time.
Well, it was a big time. You know, for a bunch of non-scholarship football players, it was basically as big time as it was going to get. Yeah, it was our Super Bowl, so to speak.
As defending national champions, Ithaca was favored. The Flyers, well, many thought that just getting this far was respectable. Dayton would try to keep the game close and try and keep on trying. In the end, they won a squeaker, 63-0. Dayton overpowered Ithaca in all aspects of the game and took home their first national title in football. Rick Carter was named the Division III National Coach of the Year. In his 4 seasons, the Flyers had amassed an impressive record of 39-7-2. But as often happens with success, came other job offers. The 1980 championship game was Carter's last at UD. He would move on to Holy Cross, which competed in what was then known as the Division AA level. Tragically, he would end up leaving us much too soon.
I was stunned. We were stunned. Everyone was stunned. And actually, we had services here in Dayton in our own chapel as well as they did there. And it was really difficult for the players, especially the 1980 team where he was the head coach of our national championship team.
Coach Kelly called me and told me. And the first thing I thought of, I thought of what a loss for young men who will not have the opportunity to play under him.
In 1981, UD President Brother Raymond Fitz and Athletic Director Tom Frericks were in need of a new head football coach. They knew just who to turn to. A meeting was called with Mike Kelly.
Mike, Brother Ray and I have talked about this. We've had some of the players that you coach come in and see us. They're highly recommending you to be our head football coach. Will you take and be our new head football coach? That was the interview, I guess. I stammered around. I said, sure, I will. Mr. Frericks, is there a chance there's a contract? Is there a long-term contract, or can I get a couple? Mike, we shook hands, didn't we? That's good enough. Year to year. I said, good for me. I turned back out, walked out. I looked up at the chapel and the sun shining, and off that chapel I said, holy cow, I'm the head coach at the University of Dayton.
With Mike Kelly now leading the Flyers, the 1981 season looked much like the 1980 campaign. There was just one loss during the regular season. In the playoffs, the Flyers easily beat Augustana at snowy Welcome Stadium, and then Lawrence. It was off to Phoenix City again and a second straight appearance in the Stag Bowl. The opponent, Widener, the team the Flyers beat a year earlier after overcoming a 24-0 deficit. This time, Dayton would jump out to a 10-0 lead at halftime, but it was Widener that came back in the second half and won the game 17-10. But it had been a phenomenal 2-year run for UD, amassing an overall record of 26-2 with one national championship and a runner-up finish. The University of Dayton had cemented itself as a powerhouse in Division III football. Since Dayton was an independent, trying to find opponents willing to play the Flyers became a challenging task.
Division IIIs weren't going to play us, especially after the first couple of years. They said, well, you have a 200-piece marching band. Well, yeah. And that was the challenge for us, was scheduling in those, actually all the Division III years.
For the Flyers, success continued. There was another playoff appearance in 1984, a trip to the championship game once again in 1987, and then another undefeated season in 1989 that led to a fourth trip to the Stag Bowl in the decade and a second national championship. The recruiting recipe that started with Rick Carter and continued with Mike Kelly was paying huge dividends.
Honestly, it's a miracle that I ever ended up at the University of Dayton, because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything about how to be recruited, what to do, what that whole process was about, and I didn't have anybody to help me out. But the idea that if I came here, that I could play for a team that was going to play for a national championship was something that just drew me to the University of Dayton.
Husted came through in the Stag Bowl. His interception late in the game sealed the victory for the Flyers over Union, 17-7.
I couldn't have ended my career better at UD because on the very last play I ever played, I intercepted the pass that, basically sealed the win, and we won a national championship, which is a great feeling to this day.
Into the early 1990s, the Flyers continued to be extremely successful on the football field. There was a playoff appearance in 1990. Another trip to the championship game in 1991 resulted into a 34-20 loss to Ithaca. 1992 would see yet another Dayton Flyers playoff team. And then it ended. The member institutions of the NCAA adopted a new rule which would prohibit schools from being classified as Division III in football if other athletic programs were Division I. Since Dayton was playing at the Division I level in all other sports, football would now have to do the same. It became known as the Dayton Rule.
And it affected far more than just the University of Dayton. But the fact that we were so successful, particularly in that first appearance in the championship game, there was a move to have the Division III would not allow people to be eligible for the championship for their playoffs.
No Division III, no scholarships. Division I AA would challenge the Dayton football program. Several other schools in the same situation would band together to form the Pioneer Football League in 1993. At first, there was no automatic playoff spot for Pioneer League teams. Dayton officials worked to remedy the oversight.
There were 10 programs with 100 student athletes in that program, in each program, and so they were the only 1,000 student athletes in the NCAA at any level, Division I, II, or III, who didn't have an opportunity, if they won a championship, to participate in an NCAA championship, which just on the surface doesn't feel good to anybody.
Beginning in 2012, PFL teams would finally be allowed to compete in the postseason in the Football Championship Series. In spite of the change in divisions and a move into a football league, there were two constant threads in Dayton football. The first, an almost unbelievable stretch of success. From 1981 until 2007, the Flyers had only one season where the team record slipped below 500, and there were an astounding 12 seasons with double-digit wins. The second constant, Mike Kelly on the sidelines, at practice, during games, fronting and promoting Flyer football at every turn. For those who played for him, he made a lasting impression on their lives that many will never forget. Some of those impressions were serious, some humorous, and maybe a few just a bit quirky.
Coach Kelly's very superstitious, and I didn't know if you were aware of that. Prior to every game, because we would get dressed at Baujan, which is here on campus, and then we would have to take buses over to the Welcome Stadium. But there was 3 players that Coach Kelly had, because he drove his personal car, and he had to have the same 3 players in his car. As you're winning, and those superstitions get more and more embedded into, okay, this is the way we did it last week, this is the way we're going to do it this week.
There is a sense of respect that he commands, and not just by being authoritative, but just by the way he runs practice, the way he governs the football program, the way he carries himself. I really admired that about him.
It was the grow up moments, those life moments, those fight through adversity moments, and learning how to overcome challenges is what I will truly, really remember and carry with me.
This is a program. It's not one person.
By the end of the 2007 season and 27 years as head coach of the Flyers, Mike Kelly had amassed an overall record of 246, 54, and 1, an astounding winning percentage of .819. And then he decided he was done.
No, I had made the decision, didn't tell my athletic director. I didn't talk to the president, didn't talk with anybody else, just my wife and I. And once it was over, then I got together with Ted Kissel and Tim Wobbler, who was in charge of football at that time, and said, I'm ready to wrap it up.
Honestly, felt all those years that he was just fooling people. He was so afraid that somebody's going to find out he's not as good as they think he is, which in fact, he probably is a better coach than what he gives himself credit for.
Mike Kelly would go on to become the second Dayton head football coach to be named to the College Football Hall of Fame. As he exited the program, he had an idea as to who the next head football coach should be. The passing of the torch would have a familiar ring.
Ted Kissel stands up. He says, "Congratulations, you're our new head football coach at Dayton." And I said, "Thank you." And then Coach Kelly was down with the team, because it hadn't been announced yet that he was stepping down. He was down with our winter workouts, and I walked down there after the meeting, and he looks at me and he says, "How did it go?" And I said, "I'm the new head football coach." And he gave me a high five right there on the gym floor.
Rick Chamberlain was a highly touted high school football player from nearby Springfield. He chose UD, putting aside offers from several MAC schools. He showed up at Dayton in the fall of 1975, driving his 1969 Ford Mustang. He was a standout at linebacker on the Flyers squads of the late 1970s. He was a 4-year letter winner, and he earned All-American honors in 1978. After earning his degree, he immediately joined the UD coaching staff as a grad assistant. He moved up the ranks, eventually becoming defensive coordinator until following Mike Kelly as head coach. Chamberlain's involvement with Flyer football stretched for an astounding 47 years. In early 2022, he won his 100th game as head coach. He played a role in more than 390 UD victories, more than half of all wins in school history. After retiring at the end of the 2022 season, Chamberlain left a program that's successful by any standard. As someone who has witnessed more success than anyone, Rick Chamberlain believes the best of times might be right now.
Our football program's better now than it was in 1975 when we were a scholarship football program. There's no doubt. It's better. Equipment, facilities, travel, it's better. The environment on campus is better with what's available to our students. That's what I have noticed, is that constant improvement.
I don't know this for a fact, but I bet you can count on one hand in all of college football, over probably a century and a half of college football, that someone has come in and was a student athlete, player, 4 years, a captain, a grad assistant, a linebacker coach, defensive coordinator, head coach, never left. We couldn't have scripted any better, and to have this guy in charge of our program.
With Rick Chamberlain stepping aside, Dayton turned to another former Flyer. Trevor Andrews played for UD in the 1990s, including the undefeated 1996 team. He brings 25 years of coaching experience back to Dayton. Trevor Andrews understands the unique nature of the Dayton program and that it's about more than just football.
Come on, Jack. Come on, Jack. Find it.
So much in college football is about recruiting and not about developing people anymore. This is going to be a place where we're going to come, we're going to compete, we're going to win football games, and you're going to leave here a better man than you got here. You're going to go out and you're going to be a positive contributor to society, in some way, shape, or form in whatever field you want to go to.
The proof of the success beyond the playing field is in the numbers. Impressively, the University of Dayton football program has had more players earn academic All-American honors this century than any other school in the country. In all, it adds up to success. Some may find it hard to explain why the University of Dayton has had such a high level of achievement, but to those that have taken to the field to play as Flyers, they understand. To them, they will never forget how being a Flyer has impacted their lives.
Very fortunate, to have the experience here because of people who looked out for the little guy, which I felt I was. I've been a guy that would have not had the opportunity to go to University of Dayton without the people involved in my life who inspired me.
I don't know what I would have done without it. I mean, I really don't.
I'm proud that I was a part of this program, and I like to brag about it. I wouldn't trade them for anything in the world.
My 4 or 5 years here at the University of Dayton as a football player was a microcosm of life. Starting at the bottom, working your way up, and achieving success.